The thread had come loose at the hem again, a small unraveling that Su-Yin Zhao had mended so many times the patch of stitches had grown into its own small history. She stood in the doorway of Holbrook's Garment and Dry Goods in Copper Creek, Wyoming territory, and pressed the loose thread flat with her thumb before anyone inside could see it. The dress was light brown, the color of dust that had once been something finer, and it had been washed so many times the fabric had gone thin at the elbows and soft as paper at the collar. She was 26 years old, and she had buried her husband 11 months earlier in a plot of ground that still did not have a proper marker, because a marker cost money she did not have. What she had instead was 43 cents wrapped in a handkerchief in her pocket, counted twice on the walk into town, and a hope that Holbrook's kept something on the cheap rack that would not fall apart before the first frost. The bell over the door rang when she stepped inside, too loud in a shop gone suddenly, deliberately quiet. Mrs. Opal Holbrook stood behind the counter, her hands folded over a bolt of blue calico, and two customers, a stout woman named Dorothea Pratt and her younger cousin, stood near the window examining ribbons they had no intention of buying quickly. All three sets of eyes moved to Su-Yin Zhao and stayed there. "Well now," Opal Holbrook said, in a voice pitched for the whole room to hear, "look what the wind blew in." Su-Yin kept her chin level. "I am looking for a dress," she said. "Something plain. Something on the cheap rack if you have one." Dorothea Pratt let out a laugh that had no warmth anywhere in it. "Honey," she said, looking Su-Yin over from collar to hem, "from the state of you, I'd say you already found the cheapest dress in the territory. You're wearing it." The cousin laughed too, a high, thin sound, and Opal Holbrook did not correct either of them. She only smiled the particular smile of a woman who enjoyed being the one holding the door someone else wanted opened. "We don't exactly keep charity racks here," Mrs. Holbrook said. "This is a respectable shop. Perhaps you'd do better at the trading post, where they don't mind selling to folks who can't pay proper coin." "I have coin," Su-Yin said, quiet, and set the handkerchief on the counter, the coins inside it clinking together with a sound too small for the room they were standing in. Dorothea Pratt leaned toward her cousin without lowering her voice at all. 40 cents, she said, like she had counted it through the cloth by sight alone. "That dress she's wearing has more darn than dress left in it. I wonder her husband didn't leave her for a woman who knew how to keep herself decent." Something in Su-Yin's chest went very still, the particular stillness of a person deciding, in the space of one breath, whether to let a thing land or whether to answer it. Her husband, Thomas Zhao, had died of a fever 11 months back, working a claim that had never paid out the way either of them had hoped it would when they married, and there was no version of Dorothea Pratt's comment that did not reach directly into that grief and twist. "I will take my business elsewhere," Su-Yin said, and reached to gather the handkerchief of coins from the counter. That was when the door opened again, and every head in the shop, including Su-Yin's, turned toward the sound. Caleb Marsh was not a man who commanded a room by trying to. He stood just inside the doorway with the summer heat still clinging to his shoulders, hat in one hand, and took in the scene with the particular slowness of a man who had learned, out on a ranch with no one else to talk to for weeks at a stretch, not to speak before he understood what he was looking at. He was 38 years old, and he owned 400 acres of grazing land 2 hours outside Copper Creek that he worked mostly alone since his brother had moved east 3 years back. Folks in town knew him as polite, quiet, and unmarried, the kind of man who paid his accounts in full and never asked for credit, and who came into town only when the ranch required it. He looked first at Opal Holbrook, then at Dorothea Pratt, still smiling over her last remark, then at the young woman standing at the counter with a handkerchief of coins clutched in one hand and her spine held so straight it looked like it might crack under the effort. Something about the room's silence told him exactly what kind of moment he had walked into. "Ma'am," he said, and it took a beat for anyone to realize he was speaking to Su Yin, not to the shopkeeper. "You were ahead of me. Go on and finish your business." Su Yin's eyes flicked to him, wary, uncertain whether this was one more version of the same cruelty wearing a gentler face. "I was leaving," she said. "Seems a shame," he said, "to leave without what you came for." Dorothea Pratt's smile thinned considerably. "Mr. Marsh," she said, with the false brightness of someone regrouping quickly, "I'm sure you don't want to trouble yourself. This is a small matter between the shop and its customers." Caleb set his hat down on the counter with a care that felt, somehow, louder than if he had slammed it. "Mrs. Pratt," he said, "I believe I heard you say something about this lady's husband a moment ago. I'd like to hear you say it again, plainer, so I understand it correctly." The cousin's laugh died somewhere in her throat. Dorothea Pratt opened her mouth, found nothing useful in it, and closed it again. "That is what I thought," Caleb said, and turned to Opal Holbrook. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said, "I've bought my work shirts and my winter coats from this shop for 6 years running. I always assumed that meant something to you, the way steady business is supposed to mean something to a shopkeeper. Was I wrong about that?" "No, sir," Mrs. Holbrook said, her voice considerably smaller than it had been a minute before. "Of course not." "Then I expect you'll help this lady find whatever she came in for," he said, "and I expect the price on the tag will be the honest price, same as you'd charge me." Su Yin stood very still through all of this, watching a man she had never spoken to before rearrange the entire temperature of a room with nothing louder than a level voice and a few plain sentences. She was not accustomed to being defended. In 11 months of widowhood, she had grown used to standing alone in rooms exactly like this one, absorbing whatever the room decided to hand her, because there had been no one left to stand beside her since Thomas died. "I don't need rescuing," she said to Caleb, quiet enough that only he and the counter between them could hear it. "I didn't say you did," he said. "I said you were ahead of me in line, and I intend to wait my turn like anybody else. What you do with the room once it remembers its manners is entirely your business, ma'am." Something in that answer settled oddly in her chest. Not gratitude exactly, something closer to surprise that a man could offer help without expecting to be thanked for the shape of it. Opal Holbrook, red-faced and suddenly eager to be helpful, produced a plain gray work dress from a shelf behind the counter. Sturdy cotton, unremarkable, priced fair. Su Yin counted out 38 cents from her handkerchief, and Mrs. Holbrook did not argue the price, and Dorothea Pratt found something urgent to examine near the door until the transaction was finished. When Su Yin turned to leave, the parcel tucked under one arm, Caleb Marsh was still standing near the counter, waiting, exactly as he had said he would. "You didn't have to do that," she said, once they were both out on the boardwalk, the noise of the shop shut away behind the door. "No," he agreed, "I didn't." "Then why?" she asked. He considered the question longer than she expected, turning his hat once in his hands before answering. "Because I've buried people too," he said, "and I know what it costs to stand in a room by yourself and let strangers decide what your grief is worth. Seemed like a poor way to spend an afternoon, watching it happen twice in one lifetime and doing nothing about it the second time." Word of what happened in Holbrook's shop moved through Copper Creek the way word always moved through a small territorial town, fast and reshaped with every telling, so that by supper time half the town had heard some version of the story where Caleb Marsh had put Dorothea Pratt in her place over a widow's dress, and the other half had heard a colder version where he had made a public spectacle for reasons folks were eager to speculate about. Su Yin heard about the speculation from her neighbor, a kind but talkative woman named Ruth Calder, who brought over a jar of preserves 2 days later, along with every rumor attached to it. "They're saying he's sweet on you," Ruth said, setting the jar on Su Yin's small kitchen table. "Saying it's the only reason a man like Caleb Marsh would trouble himself over a shopkeeper's manners." Su Yin kept her eyes on the bread she was kneading. "That is not what happened," she said. "He was decent. There is a difference between decent and sweet on someone." Ruth raised an eyebrow but did not push it, and Su Yin was grateful for that, because she did not entirely trust her own certainty on the matter. She had thought of Caleb Marsh more than once since the shop, an intrusion she resented slightly, since she had spent 11 months training herself not to think of any man at all, not since Thomas. She lived on a half-section of land at the edge of town that Thomas had claimed under the Homestead Act 3 years before he died, land she had a legal right to keep as his widow, provided she could prove she was working it, which was growing harder by the season. She had a small garden, 2 goats, and a debt at the feed store that climbed a little higher every month, and she had begun to understand, with the particular clarity that comes from staring at numbers that do not add up, that she would lose the claim within the year if something did not change. She did not expect Caleb Marsh to be the something. He came by her place 8 days after the incident at Hallbrook's, riding in slow enough that she had time to see him from the garden before he reached the fence line, and she straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and waited, unsure what expression to arrange her face into. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted, "I hope I'm not troubling you." "You're not," she said, though she was not entirely certain that was true. He looked around the small holding, the goats, the garden rows, the modest house that needed its roof patched before winter, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity, she noted carefully, but a kind of appraisal, the look of a man assessing a problem he might know how to solve. "I heard you're working this claim alone," he said, "since your husband passed." "I am," she said, "and I intend to keep working it." "I don't doubt that," he said. "I came to ask if you'd consider a business arrangement, not charity," he added quickly, before she could bristle at the word. "I've got more grazing land than I can properly manage since my brother left, and you've got water rights on this section that could serve both our herds if we shared the cost of fencing it right. I'd pay you a fair rate for the access. Might be enough to keep you square with the feed store through winter." Su Yin studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer against the particular exhaustion of a woman who had learned to distrust generosity that arrived without a catch attached. "Why would you offer that?" she asked. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you stood in that shop and didn't cry, didn't beg, and didn't let them see you rattled, even when they were doing their level best to rattle you. That tells me something about how a person handles hardship. I'd rather do business with someone who handles hardship well than someone who's never had to." She did not answer right away. Behind her, one of the goats bleated at nothing in particular, and the summer wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like paper. "I'll think on it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking," he said, and swung back up onto his horse, and did not push further. Which she noted was, in its own quiet way, its own kind of answer about the sort of man he was. She agreed to the arrangement 2 weeks later, after the feed store debt climbed high enough that pride stopped being a currency she could afford to spend. The fencing work took the better part of a month, Caleb's hired hands running new line along the shared water access, while Su Yin kept her own herd moved and her garden tended. And somewhere in the long, ordinary hours of a shared task, something began to change between them that neither of them named out loud. He showed up most days around midday, Not because the work required it, she suspected, but because he had started finding reasons to be near her section of fence when the sun was highest and the work paused for water and shade. He was not a talker by nature, but she learned, in the silences between them, that his quiet was not emptiness. It was a man choosing his words carefully because he had learned somewhere along the way that most words did more harm poured out than held back. "You lost your husband," he said one afternoon, sitting on an overturned bucket near the half-finished fence line, not quite a question. "Fever," she said, 11 months back. He worked a claim 2 valleys over before we married proper. Never struck anything worth the effort, but he believed it was there. I think some part of him believed it right up until the end." Caleb turned his hat over once in his hands, a habit she had noticed he returned to whenever a conversation moved somewhere honest. "I lost someone too," he said. "Not a wife, a brother, in the years before the one who moved east. Younger than me. Territorial dispute over grazing land turned violent one summer, and he was standing in the wrong place when it did." "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said, though something in the way he said it told her the distance of years had not done as much healing as he might have liked people to believe. "I built this ranch partly because I didn't know what else to do with the grief. Kept working the land because working it was easier than sitting still with what happened." She recognized that particular arithmetic, the way labor could be its own form of mourning, because she had done the same thing every day for 11 months. Hands in the soil, hands on the loom, hands doing anything that kept her from sitting still with the shape of what she had lost. "I understand that better than you might think," she said. "I suspect you do," he said, and for a moment neither of them said anything further, and the silence between them was not empty the way silence with strangers is empty. It had weight to it, the particular weight of 2 people recognizing the same wound in each other from opposite sides of a fence they were building together. The trouble arrived 3 weeks after that, in the shape of a man named Bartholomew Ness, a cattle broker who had spent 2 years trying to acquire water rights along that same stretch of land through means that had grown less patient with every failed attempt. Ness rode out to Su Yin's holding on a Tuesday afternoon, with 2 hired men trailing him, and an offer that was not really an offer at all. "Mrs. Zhao," he said, not bothering to dismount, "I understand you've entered an arrangement with Marsh regarding water access. I'll be direct with you. That water was promised to my operation before your husband ever filed his claim, and I intend to see the matter settled properly, one way or another." "There is no prior claim on this water," Su Yin said, standing her ground at the edge of her own garden. "My husband's deed is recorded at the territorial office. You are welcome to check it yourself." "Deeds can be contested," Ness said, with the particular politeness of a man who found threats more effective when delivered gently, especially deeds belonging to widows without family to press the matter in court. "I'd hate to see you spend money you don't have fighting a battle you can't win." "Is that a threat, Mr. Ness?" she asked, and did not let her voice shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her apron, had curled into fists. "It's a kindness," he said. "Consider selling the claim to me now, before things grow complicated. I'll pay a fair price. Better than what you'll have left after a legal fight drains you dry." She held his gaze without blinking. "My husband died proving up this claim," she said. "I intend to keep it exactly the way he left it to me. You may show yourself off my land now, Mr. Ness." Something flickered across his face, not quite anger, something colder and more calculating, and he touched the brim of his hat with exaggerated courtesy before turning his horse. "We'll speak again, Mrs. Zhao," he said, and rode off with his 2 men trailing behind him, and Su-yin stood alone in her garden with her heart pounding, understanding for the first time that the fence line she and Caleb Marsh had been building together had just become the front line of something much larger. Caleb learned of the visit that same evening when he rode out to check the last stretch of fence and found Su-yin still shaken, standing at her gate with her arms wrapped around herself despite the lingering summer heat. "Ness came here," she said, before he had even dismounted. "He said the water was promised to him before Thomas filed the claim. He said deeds could be contested. He offered to buy me out before things grew, as he put it, complicated." Caleb's jaw tightened, the same small motion she had come to recognize as the outward edge of a temper he kept mostly buried. "That man has been circling this water for 2 years, he said. He tried the same approach with 3 other claims east of here. Every one of them folded because they didn't have anyone willing to stand alongside them when the pressure came." "I'm not folding," she said. "I know that," he said, and something in his voice softened even as the tension in his shoulders did not. "I'm not asking if you're folding. I'm telling you that you won't be standing alone in this if you'll have me stand with you." She studied him in the low evening light. The dust settled gold across the fence posts, the goats quiet in their pen, and she thought about 11 months of standing alone in every room she had entered, absorbing whatever the world decided to hand her because there had been no one left to share the weight of it. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked, the question she had been circling since the day in Hallbrook's shop. "This isn't your fight. It isn't your land." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something rawer than she had heard from him before. "Because I've spent 6 years since my brother died making sure nobody could get close enough to matter to me again," he said. "Told myself the ranch was enough. Told myself quiet was easier than caring about something that could be taken from me. Then I walked into that shop and watched you stand there and refuse to break, and something in me that had gone very quiet for a very long time decided it wasn't finished yet." Su-yin felt something crack open in her chest. Not grief this time, something that had been sealed shut alongside the grief for so long she had nearly forgotten it existed. "I told myself the same thing," she said, quiet, "that I would work this land alone and want nothing more than the land itself. It was easier to believe that than to risk wanting something I could lose again." "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said, "but I want you to know where I stand. I intend to help you keep this claim, whatever Ness tries next. Whether that changes anything else between us is entirely up to you." She stepped closer to him, close enough that the space between them felt charged in a way the summer evening alone could not explain, and for a long moment neither of them moved, both of them standing at the edge of something neither had let themselves want in a very long time. "I don't know how to do this carefully," she admitted. "I've only ever loved once, and it ended in a fever in a grave without a proper marker." "Then we won't do it carefully," he said. "We'll do it honestly, one day at a time, and see where honest gets us." She reached up and touched the side of his face, the first deliberate touch either of them had allowed themselves, and he went very still under it, the way a man goes still when something he has wanted without permitting himself to want it finally arrives. When he kissed her, it was slow and certain, nothing like the desperate grasping she might have expected from 2 lonely people finding each other in a hard season, but something steadier, something that felt like 2 people choosing, with clear eyes, to risk being known again. The trouble with Bartholomew Ness did not go quiet after that. If anything, word that Caleb Marsh and the widow Zhao had grown close only sharpened his resolve. because a united front was a harder thing to break than a woman standing alone, and men like Ness did not tend to accept defeat with grace. Ness's next move came 10 days later, not as a visit, but as a fire, set deliberately along the dry grass at the edge of Su Yin's northern fence line in the middle of a summer night when the whole territory had gone weeks without rain. Su Yin woke to the smell of smoke thick enough to catch in her throat, and she was out the door and running for the goat pen before she had fully understood what was happening, the sky above the fence line already glowing an ugly orange against the dark. She got the goats loose and moving toward the creek, driving them with a stick in her own raw voice, but the fire was spreading faster than she could outrun it on foot, eating through dry grass toward the fence line Caleb's men had spent a month building, toward the house itself if the wind did not turn. Caleb saw the glow from his own ranch 2 miles off and was on his horse before he had fully processed what he was looking at, riding hard through the dark with 3 of his hands behind him. And when he reached Su Yin's holding, he found her already fighting the fire with a wet blanket in sheer stubbornness, beating at flames that had crept along the fence line toward the barn. "Get back!" he shouted, swinging down from his horse and grabbing a second blanket from his saddlebag. "This section's going to jump the fence line any minute." "I'm not leaving my barn to burn," she shouted back, and kept beating at the flames alongside him rather than retreating. And there was no time to argue the point further because the fire had found a patch of dry brush and roared up suddenly, close enough that Caleb grabbed her arm and pulled her 3 steps back before it could catch her skirt. For the next hour they fought the fire together with the men Caleb had brought, digging a brake line ahead of the flames with shovels pulled from the barn, soaking blankets in the creek and beating back every flare that threatened to jump the gap. And somewhere in the smoke and the exhausted, coordinated labor of it, Su Yin understood that this was not luck keeping her land from burning. It was 2 people who had decided, without needing to say it aloud again, that they were not facing this alone. The fire finally died against the brake line an hour before dawn, leaving a wide black scar across the northern pasture, but sparing the house, the barn, and the goats Su Yin had driven to safety. She stood in the gray pre-dawn light, covered in soot and shaking with exhaustion, and looked at the ruined grass and felt, underneath the exhaustion, something that surprised her. Not despair. Anger. Clean and useful. "This was Ness," she said. "I'd stake my ranch on it," Caleb said, wiping soot from his forehead with the back of a blackened hand. "But staking it isn't proof. And proof is what we need if we're going to see him answer for this in front of a territorial judge, instead of just running him off with harsh words." It was Ruth Calder, arriving with bread and worry 2 mornings later, who provided the proof neither of them had expected. Her husband worked freight routes through the territory, and he had passed one of Ness's hired men in a saloon 2 towns over, drunk and boastful, describing in specific and incriminating detail how his employer had paid him to set a fire and blame it on dry lightning. Ruth had written down every word she could recall her husband repeating, and within the week, Caleb had ridden 2 days to fetch the territorial marshal himself, armed with Ruth's account and the burned scar of pasture as evidence enough to open a formal inquiry. Bartholomew Ness did not wait for the marshal to arrive before he left the territory entirely. His operation quietly sold off within a month to a rancher 2 counties over who wanted nothing to do with the reputation attached to it. And Copper Creek settled, slowly, back into its ordinary rhythms, minus 1 broker who had learned too late that a widow with a fence, a temper, and a rancher willing to stand beside her was not the easy target he had assumed. 4 months later, the northern pasture had begun to green over again where the fire had scarred it, thin new grass pushing up through the blackened ground in a way that Su Yin found she could not look at without thinking of her own life these past months, burned down to almost nothing and finding its way back regardless. The fence Caleb's men had built stood strong along the water line, shared now between two herds that grazed the same stretch of grass without dispute, and the arrangement that had begun as a business proposition over feed store debts had become something neither of them described in business-like terms anymore. Caleb had moved his smaller herd onto her section entirely that autumn, and spent more nights at her table than at his own, and neither of them had made a public announcement of any kind, because, in a town the size of Copper Creek, some things simply became known by being lived out loud, day after ordinary day. The feed store debt was paid in full by harvest season, the water rights arrangement bringing in more than either of them had expected once Ness's disruption cleared out of the picture, and Su-Yin had used part of the surplus to finally set a proper marker over Thomas's grave, a plain stone with his name cut into it, because grief, she had learned, did not require forgetting the man who came before in order to make room for the man who came after. Ruth Calder came by more often that autumn than she ever had before, bringing bread and news and the occasional piece of gossip that had lost its sting now that Copper Creek had settled back into its ordinary rhythms, and she found Su-Yin more often than not sitting on the porch step with mending in her lap and a contentment in her face that Ruth had not seen there since before Thomas passed. "You look easy," Ruth told her once. "Easy in a way I haven't seen on you in a long while." Su-Yin only smiled and kept stitching, because some things did not need saying out loud to be true, and easy was as fine a word as any for what she had found. She stood at that grave on a quiet afternoon in early autumn, Caleb waiting a respectful distance off near the fence line, and she found she could speak to the stone, without the old ache pulling her under the way it once had. "I kept the land," she said. "I want you to know that. I kept it, and I didn't do it alone, and I think you would have liked him, if things had gone different enough for you two to meet." The wind moved through the dry grass the way it always did in that country, indifferent and constant, and she stood a moment longer before walking back toward the fence line where Caleb waited, his hat in his hands, the same patient way he had waited outside Holbrook's shop the day everything between them began. The stone Su-Yin chose for Thomas sat beneath a young cottonwood near the eastern fence, plain and honest, cut simply with his name and the years of his life, and she visited it often enough that the path to it had worn a thin line through the grass. Caleb never once suggested she visit less, and never once made her feel that honoring the man before him was any threat to what they were building together, which she had come to understand was its own quiet kind of love. Back at Holbrook's Garment and Dry Goods, Opal Holbrook had taken to keeping a small rack of fairly priced work dresses near the front window, an arrangement she never explained to anyone who asked, though most folks in town understood well enough what had prompted the change. Dorothea Pratt still came into the shop from time to time, though she had grown noticeably more careful about who she chose to mock within earshot of the door, having learned, the hard way, that Copper Creek was smaller than pride liked to pretend. Su-Yin never did forget the sound of that laughter in the shop, the particular sting of standing in a room built to make her feel small. But she found, standing now on land that was fully hers, beside a man who had chosen to stand with her before he had any reason to expect a reward for it, that the memory had lost its power to wound her the way it once had. Some rooms decide what you are worth before they know a single true thing about you. It is worth remembering that their judgment was never really the one that mattered. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.